Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. When you picture the Roman army, what comes to mind? Towering shields, disciplined legions marching in perfect formation, the gleam of a gladiator's sword. Right, the mighty Roman infantryman is an icon of ancient warfare. But what about the soldiers who fought from a distance? What about the archers? Did the Romans, with their legendary legions, even bother with bows and arrows? It's a fantastic question, and the answer is a lot more complex and interesting than a simple yes or no. The story of archers in the Roman military is one of evolution, adaptation, and a gradual, sometimes reluctant, acceptance of a new way of war. So, today, we're going to pull back the bowstring on history and uncover the fascinating, often overlooked, role of archers in the Roman war machine. In the early days of the Roman Republic, the army was overwhelmingly focused on its heavy infantry. The legionary was the heart and soul of their military doctrine. They fought up close and personal, and they were devastatingly effective. In this system, missile troops like slingers and javelinmen, known as *vilites*, played a supporting role, mostly to harass the enemy before the main clash of infantry. Archers, they were practically an afterthought. The early Romans didn't have a strong native tradition of archery, especially not for military purposes. Unlike cultures in the East, like the Parthians or the Scythians, where archery was central to their identity in warfare. For the Romans, it was a specialist skill they didn't cultivate themselves. So, when they did need archers, where did they get them? They did what the Romans did best. They outsourced and relied on allied or auxiliary troops, known as *auxilia*. These were soldiers recruited from the non-Roman peoples within the Republic and, later, the Empire. And when it came to archery, one group stood out. The Cretans. Cretan archers were famous throughout the ancient Mediterranean for their skill. They were mercenaries, and the Romans hired them to supplement their legions. Their job was typically defensive, to stand behind the main battle line and rain arrows on an approaching enemy, disrupting their formation and thinning their ranks before the legionaries charged in to finish the job. So, in these early stages, archers were present, but they were foreign specialists, a support unit, not a core part of the Roman army. They were a useful tool, but not one the Romans themselves were eager to master. But things started to change. As Rome expanded and its enemies became more diverse, its military had to adapt. And one man who was a master of adaptation was none other than Julius Caesar. During his famous conquest of Gaul, Caesar faced a huge variety of opponents, from heavy Gallic infantry to swift Germanic cavalry. He needed a flexible army, and he recognized the value of missile troops in a way many of his predecessors hadn't. Caesar made extensive use of foreign archers in his campaigns. He hired Cretans, just as his predecessors had, but also Numidians and even Germanic bowmen. He didn't just use them in a static, defensive role either. Caesar was a tactical genius. He would use his archers to protect the vulnerable flanks of his legions from cavalry charges. Imagine a wave of horsemen bearing down on your line. A well-timed volley of arrows could break their charge, sow chaos, and give your infantry the edge they needed. He also used them to counter enemy skirmishers and to provide covering fire during sieges. For Caesar, archers weren't just a defensive shield. They were a versatile tactical weapon. They were becoming more integrated, more important, but they were still, for the most part, foreigners fighting alongside the legions, not within them. The real turning point, where archers went from a marginal support unit to a significant force on the battlefield, came during the brutal civil wars that tore the late Republic apart. The conflict between Caesar and Pompey the Great saw massive armies clashing, and both sides were looking for any advantage they could get. Pompey, having spent years campaigning in the East, had seen firsthand the power of massed archery. When he prepared to face Caesar at the decisive Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, he assembled a huge contingent of archers. We're talking thousands of them, drawn from Crete, Syria, and other eastern provinces. His plan was to use this overwhelming missile superiority to shatter Caesar's legions before his own infantry even made contact. This was a major shift. Archers were no longer just a small supporting group. They were a key component of Pompey's battle plan. Caesar, in turn, had to figure out how to counter this threat. It shows that by the end of the Republic, Roman generals were thinking seriously about archery on a grand scale. The bow and arrow had arrived as a major player on the Roman battlefield. The days of archers being a mere footnote were well and truly over. So Pompey's plan with his thousands of archers sounds pretty solid, right? Well, at Pharsalus, it didn't quite work out. Caesar, ever the brilliant tactician, anticipated Pompey's move. He held back a special reserve of his toughest legionaries, and at the critical moment, ordered them to charge directly at Pompey's cavalry and archers, using their shields to protect themselves and their javelins as pikes. The surprise attack shattered the cavalry, which fled, leaving the lightly armored archers completely exposed. They were routed. But the failure of the tactic doesn't diminish its significance. The fact that a general like Pompey staked so much on his archers shows how important they had become. After the Republic fell and the Empire rose, this trend only continued. As the Roman Empire reached its greatest extent, it came into constant conflict with enemies who were masters of the bow, most famously the Parthians and their successors, the Sassanid Persians. Fighting these horse-archer armies in the deserts of the East was a nightmare for traditional Roman legions. The Parthians would refuse to engage in a straight-up fight. They'd gallop in, fire a volley of arrows, and retreat before the Romans could respond. The famous Parthian shot. To fight this new kind of war, the Romans had no choice but to embrace archery themselves. During the Imperial period, the Roman army began to formally recruit and train its own dedicated archery units. The **Sagittari**, while many were still recruited from the eastern provinces like Syria, which had a long and proud archery tradition, they were now a permanent, official part of the Roman military structure, just like a cohort of legionaries. Some were infantry archers, others were even horse archers, created specifically to counter Rome's eastern foes. They were equipped with powerful composite bows, a technology borrowed from their enemies, which were far more effective than the simple bows used earlier. By the time of the late Empire, in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, the Roman army looked very different from the army of Caesar or Scipio. The classic heavy infantryman was still there, but he was now fighting as part of a combined arms force. Archers were everywhere. They were stationed in forts along the frontiers. They fought in major field battles, and they were absolutely essential for defending the empire's vast borders. In fact, some historical sources suggest that by this late period, as much as 1/4 of the entire Roman army could have been made up of archers. That's a staggering transformation from the early days, when there were just a handful of foreign mercenaries. So, did the Romans use archers? Absolutely. But their relationship with the bow was a journey. It started with reluctance, moved to tactical necessity, and ended with full integration. The story of Roman archers is the story of the Roman military itself, a story of relentless pragmatism and adaptation in the face of new challenges. They didn't start as a nation of archers, but when they needed to be, they learned, they recruited, and they mastered the bow to maintain their dominance for centuries. What do you think? Does this change how you see the Roman legions? Let me know down in the comments. It's always great to hear your thoughts, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into a lesser-known part of military history, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel for more. It really helps us out. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.